So my name's Dr. Lani Roy. I am the, facilitator of this network, the Mental Health Practitioners Network for Psychedelics, which has been around for several years now and had incredible support from Amanda and the crew through the Department of Health network. And I am a founding board member of AMAP, which is the Australian Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Practitioners, which began about a year ago as a direct response to the very rapid TGA rescheduling changes for MDMA and psilocybin. And, we're working very hard to get NGO status and to design and create systems for safety and accountability in the field of psychedelic science. And it's, I guess I come here from a place of humanness and holding these forums because, there's a lot of mistakes to be made in this space by good intended people, as well as more of that shadowy kind of perpetratory side of human behavior as well. So, I'm very passionate about discussing ethics, helping people learn from mistakes I've made and the things I've witnessed as well. And before I hand over to Sandra, I a big passion for the field of obviously psychedelics, but also trauma and sexual abuse and power and everything that comes with that. And I think this field is hugely unique for enormous potential it can give us for consciousness and social change, but also very unique in the sense of potential for, bias, blind spots, power dynamics, abuse, gatekeeping phenomena, all of that stuff, which we'll cover today. So just a heads up with when we go to the Q&A, if we can just keep things really safe, not naming any underground guides or, even professionals. I think we can talk about themes on this platform, even organisations. I think it's, for our own safety, because Australia has some of the worst defamation laws in the world. I've been a whistleblower, I've spoken out, and when you read about the defamation laws in Australia, it's actually quite alarming how easy it is to be sued for, So I don't want to start with fear, but I just want to start with that container of we can talk about the themes, but let's just look after each other as well. And over to you, Sandra. Would you like to share a little bit about your background and then we can get into a bit of a dialogue with some certain questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for sharing this time and energy with each other. And I'm basically a ethicist. I have a MA and PhD in philosophy focused on ethics, ethical decision making, and moral psychology. The past several years, I've been working actively in the psychedelic space, so specializing in psychedelic and consciousness ethics, working with EPIC, Ethical Psychedelic International Community. I'm also director of ethics for Nectara, and have various other roles, but also consult and support people in the space around ethic and ethical practice. So I love this conversation. I just love the fact that we're having this conversation together. So yeah, a little bit about me.
Yeah, thanks for being here, and thank you for that pivotal turning point in my life when I reached out to you, just a stranger from across the other side of the world. I have a really big ethical dilemma, and being just such a beautiful support at a very pivotal turning point in my career. And so thank you for answering that call. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being willing to reach out. It's brave.
Thank you. So the first kind of question I've got today, and as we go through this discussion, really welcome people to put other questions in the chat that we can circle back to later. So if it prompts more layers of reflection or more ethical challenges, please document them so we can capture them. But I guess, Sandra, what would you say some of the unique qualities and challenges that this field of psychedelics brings, us as healthcare providers, as well as fellow journeyers as well with the medicine, what it is distinct about this field?
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. I think in some ways, I would want to say that it isn't unique, but in terms of the types of problems and ethical issues that arise, like from like a bioethics standpoint, but what is unique is the risk and the vulnerability that's really unique to psychedelic and journey states. So the same, for instance, power dynamics that exist in a therapist-patient relationship are still present in a psychedelic therapy relationship, but they're magnified. You could even say a global non-specific magnifier. So there's higher risk and higher vulnerability, and even the fact that a lot of people are coming to psychedelic therapy after having had failures from traditional medicine practices and supports, that there's a higher desperation of need that often comes to this work. So whether they have CPTSD that they've lived with for like over a decade of their life, have already tried antidepressants, have already been working with therapists, or they are maybe in a recovery from a substance. And so we see also more of the extreme cases as well, not that we don't see the full gamut like everyone else does. So there's that piece, but then the substances themselves make people extra vulnerable because of what they do, like MDMA specifically. That's now that there's therapeutic access in Australia. That's one I would definitely want to emphasize. So yeah, here's a little overview.
Yeah, and if I may share, I guess, from my observations, which is only, data point one, is the how complex it's been in Australia with you've got clients that are engaged in this, altered state work. You've got organizations that have been here, long before the psychedelic boom, that have deep relationships and roots and beliefs and values. And then you've got, an explosion of, the market, you've got competition, you've got media, you've got bad actors, you've got a lot of leaders who are working extremely hard, often not paid very well, some not paid at all. Lots of people doing medicine work who are professionals that are actually have their own trauma, who are also elevated, and potentially not getting supervision or training or mentoring. So what I felt was quite distinct and unique compared to other sectors was the level of complexity and the level of heightened, I guess, emotion and passion, and also, diversity of beliefs around, the politics of consciousness. So it felt like quite a storming phase in Australia of like, who are the leaders? Where are the leaders? Are the leaders actually safe? Are they ungrounded? Are they actually, working too hard? And, things are, happening in the mix there. So I guess that's just my reflection on the uniqueness of it compared to other sectors. And it'll be really interesting to see what's relevant. Yeah.
I mean, and you think about the same sort of dynamic of if you have extra vulnerable people and an extra powerful substances who are in and then you throw that in there with people, like, who does that attract? Right? Especially if it's been primarily illegal. People who have the experience, who have the background, have been primarily underground providers, right? And there's limits right now in terms of how many people have enough training. So then you have a whole bunch of new people coming to the space who don't have that knowledge and the background and the experience. And it may even attract people who, to an extent, who may be more interested in taking advantage of that power dynamic.
Absolutely. And I guess it raises that broader discussion around healthcare narratives and ethics, because we have obviously people that have been working in the underground. Obviously I've got to say, not endorsing that. We're on a government network here, but the reality of we have skilled people that have been using these medicines for a very, very long time, but then now the culture is obviously being pushed towards the clinical space, and potentially non-experts being positioned as experts in the space because of, they've got a registration, they've done a certificate, and I guess the challenges in the community around who has the knowledge and who has the rights to have the knowledge and who has, the rights to do this work, I think is really complex in the space at the moment, because some of the trainers leading the training could potentially have the least experience, but only have the legal experience, which
Yeah,
is
absolutely. Yeah.
Not
And
expecting
even
you to have any answers for that, but just wanted to illuminate.
no, but it's good to highlight. I mean, it's like it's kind of it's really interesting and fascinating in so many different ways. And in that sort of magnifier sense that I was mentioning earlier, like a lot of the challenges have been challenges for a while, right? The problem with leadership being abusive, therapists who take advantage of their clients, not having a good relationship with First Nations or the people, you know, of origin, right? And respecting their traditions and their medicine ways. Uh, they're all still an issue. They were an issue before, but now we're having to pay attention to it in a bigger way because it's coming to the surface in a very direct way, and a very important way. But it was important before, right? And I'm in some sense thankful for the attention of it, and also just the reason why it's coming up is because of the real deeply powerful transformational ability and capacity for these medicines, and to honor and appreciate our consciousness and our, whether it's for emotional, mental, or physical healing, but also spiritual. And so some of that spiritual aspects that is lost sometimes in the larger conversation is coming to the foreground too. So
Yes, complex,
yeah.
exciting times. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we might there's two kind of more hot topics at the moment, or controversial topics, shall I say. In Australia, there's been two recent kind of media events where authorised prescribers who have done the dosing of MDMA with their patients have spoken out to the media, one with the patient and another just through a de-identified written article. So they've shared the client kind of story and the success of the medicines and their passion obviously for this work. And I'm bringing this conversation up not to shame the authorised prescribers, because most of the time I believe these issues occur out of potential excitement and passion, not necessarily intending to do harm. But what really was concerning for me was that the treatment protocol hadn't finished. So both clients were still in that process and being brought to the media attention. I still think there's challenges, even if it is de-identified, because that client and that psychiatrist have entered a space of, this is working, this is great, let's share, and the process hasn't finished. So I just wanted to hear your perspective on the complexities of that process of bringing clients to the media before the process is even over.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, well, one is just literally what you mentioned, like, well, if you're doing a treatment protocol, and this is what the protocol recommends, to bring someone to media attention before that protocol has been finished. If they haven't, in terms of informed consent agreements and had conversations about, I plan on not only going through an MDMA protocol, but I'm willing to stop the middle of my treatment and engage with media and to have my story shared. I'm guessing that's probably not what happened. So there's that part, just the regular issues around consent, but that aspect of vulnerability, there's some unique factors that show up in terms of capacity of a client, both post and during. Most people spend a lot of time paying attention to, like, well, what state you're in during an altered state, like, MDMA, like you're taking MDMA. This is you people get that, like, okay, I'm on the substance, just as if you were like knocked unconscious for surgery, right? You understand that you are compromised. But what's one of the things that's unique about psychedelic experiences and how it affects the brain, and what we know from science currently, is that there is a vulnerability window where that same neuroplasticity that gives the ability for us to gain a lot of benefit, not just like in MDMA's case, where you have the ability to access and have that sort of therapeutic alliance that goes deeper when there may be barriers to that because of a trauma response, right? Like the amygdala is calmed, you go out of the frontal cortex, while you're on the substance, but there's also a window afterwards. And there's more and more research on this, and it varies for different substances, but you're more vulnerable because you're literally rebuilding that aspects of the brain. And you may be more compliant and more open or more positive, or but regardless of what we want to say or describe about that state, we know for a fact that you are more vulnerable. And so the idea that you could ask someone who's knowingly in the middle of a protocol to consent to media, which is a very big thing. It's not just, like, oh, can I tell this other provider, right, to share research findings, right? And which even that would be an issue. It's going public in a very large way that has significant effects. So the risk is really high. And for a fact you've given them a substance that makes them more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't mean that you can't aim to get consent, just like you can ask for consent, for instance, for parents whose kids may be in an emergency room and you have to make an emergency medical decision, that your capacity is diminished and it is slightly coercive because
Mm-hmm.
of the situation. But if you don't have to, if there's not a direct need, then I would personally recommend, if it were me or someone was asking me as an ethicist, given what I know about the facts of these sort of situations, it's better to wait. So that they can have the greater capacity, even if they're fully optimistic and excited about sharing. And so that you're getting more, they're supporting their autonomy, their ability to make their own decisions. And so what happens in a case like that is that that same person on the other side of the protocol may object to their information and being shared by media. They may be fine with it, but you run that risk, and you're basically using someone more as a sort of, in a Kantian sense, a more mere means to your ends. It's more extractive, and it's focused on, or at least it appears to be, more in the interest of, promoting a therapeutic approach, which also has risks too, independent to the person, right? The other thing outside the person is that you're also modeling for other therapists how to conduct these protocols. And you're basically also modeling and saying it's okay to take a vulnerable patient, and I'm saying they're vulnerable, and use and have them share, like, let's say, do a testimonial in media, right, for the benefit of informing people or for your practice, even if it's for the best reasons. And that's what concerns me even more than the harm potentially to that one person, is also the harm to the community and to the mindset of of Australian psychedelic practice, that it's not creating that safe container and support and recognizing the greater need for protection and support when you're literally in the middle of a therapeutic process.
Absolutely. Oh, so we might actually, why don't we open up just one question from someone in the crowd if they want to speak to this issue in more detail.
I see Libby's hand up.
Yeah, it's a comment. I'm just remembering a woman I was on retreat with a lot in England who had a consultancy. She and her psychology partners would consult to reality TV shows to ensure the psychological well-being of participants, which is, of course, a particularly intense, situation. And I'm sure if they were on any kind of substance or had been in any period of time, they certainly wouldn't be recommending that they have media exposure. But what was good to see was that the service did exist, and the British Psychology Society had guidelines that they had developed around that. And I guess I would, want to see those guidelines developed in regards to this and any other media exposure that somebody's getting, because it is a particularly intense environment, whether you're anonymized or not. So yeah, I just wanted to reference British Psychology Society being on to in screen engagement, but I think the same thing applies. And their policy, I've checked to see if it's online, and it's actually not at the moment. So if I find it, I can share it.
That would be great.
Yeah, To
Yeah.
see. Yeah, and it's worth mentioning, that often a lot of therapeutic sessions, especially in clinical research trials, have been recorded. um, and with the consent of the people in advance, but not with the idea that it's going to be shown to the media, right? With the idea that it's part of oversight, which I want to say is distinct, but I appreciate like that there needs to be guidelines, and this is the sort of risks that you run when you do and you need to develop any new industry, where those protocols and those understandings, let alone like the understanding of the vulnerability and the research, it hasn't vetted it out in a particular way, that I would just in general err on the side of caution.
And I guess I wanted to add, what I've noticed through my own medicine work and experience is that your relationship with your therapist guide, it can change, and it can change, really dramatically. You can think things are going really, really well, and then you can get to a layer in your own parts or your own consciousness and the therapist consciousness that rupture. And
Yeah.
it can still be good people that are good players, but just a really deep therapeutic rupture. And I think when you have a psychiatrist that is prescribing the medication and then going to the media, it doesn't allow really the potential for that therapeutic rupture to unfold over all the transference and counter-transference over the therapeutic journey, because it's gearing it up potentially that it's all going well and it's this great story, and but yeah, what if it doesn't? And that can be such amazing medicine work as well, when there is a rupture, and then how you heal that in the triad. I think that's the complexity for me. Is it's a bit too shiny, and is it allowing that client to actually to not like the psychiatrist, to want to complain, wanting to report at some point, or ask for a different treatment provider. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, because that brings up another aspect of what kind of potential harm could happen. Like, imagine if the person did feel uncomfortable and it affected the therapeutic alliance. And so now, like, while they're in the middle of a therapeutic treatment that's supposed to be for the benefit of the client, they experience a rupture from the media share.
Yes.
Right? Then you throw in the other aspect about power dynamics, and maybe they were more complicit because of the fact that they were in this really deep active process, that even if they did say yes and give proper consent, that there was some compromise there. And so there'll be another reason to urge caution.
Yeah. And what's confusing for me, and you won't be able to answer this because it's more of a TGA APRA legal requirement, is that there was the authorized prescriber, the lived experience of the client, which is technically potentially a testimonial, which people aren't meant to do, as well as links to like the drug, the medicine supplier company on the same piece of information. So I know the laws are very different in America for how close a client can be to the knowing who the actual prescriber of the medicine is. And I'm by no means an expert in any of this, but it just felt really interesting. For the first time I'd seen that all happening kind of in one page, and I think that there's some complexities there, because in that moment, that those organizations, that the medicine supplier, got a lot of media attention, and that means a lot of business, and that means shares go up, and that's because of that person's lived experience that hasn't completed yet.
And I'm guessing they're not getting a financial benefit for the client, right? And let alone off the top, it would be, I mean, whether I can't speak to the legal issues either, but just off the top, perception wise, it seems very clear to me that it's a conflict of interest. Right? And even if, well, we create a separate contract and it just happens to show up on our site, well, there, you should consider how that is perceived and how that's marketed when you're dealing with a vulnerable client and you're dealing with a private experience that you're sharing now publicly, and then also seeming to promote a substance, when there isn't enough, and from what I understand, enough access at this point in time.
Yeah.
Right?
Which
So
then,
you actually may be promoting more harm in the space because people may try and find it from other sources, independent of whether or not it's providing to that particular medical provider of that medicine, which is also, you know, in terms of like competition and other things, right? But to me, it's pretty clearly a conflict of interest, let alone additional risk for harm.
yes. Yeah. So Libby just made a comment there. Yeah. A race for attention to lead the pack in potentially very lucrative field. Yeah, that's right. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with TGA crackdowns and testimonials and things like that, because, you know, I think it's, you know, but I have been told theoretically a lot of these potential spaces factor in fines into their business plans. So they factor in these breaches potentially to get that marketing. And, you know, I'm not making any comment about any organisation specifically, but it's just that general theme of we'll manage this, we'll take this hit because we can afford it. And they are able to keep a close eye on how far they can push it.
And to the point you were mentioning earlier, independent of what their motivations are, not that that wouldn't make a difference to us, like if they were intentionally trying to do it for self-gain and promotion and to gain a position on the marketplace, right? Even if it was an oversight and a lack of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And there should be ideally an acknowledgement and an appreciation
Yeah.
of that, so that, because like if you actually also violate trust in the larger community, that will actually harm business. And when I've talked about business ethics before, you know, I personally feel good ethics is good business. So like in the short run, it may help you get, you know, some sort of marketplace attention, and people associate the name with that particular product, for instance, or that particular doctor. And then, but later down the line, like what you were mentioning earlier about certain, at least in our conversation, different leaders in the psychedelic community internationally causing harm in this space. It actually does not just damage to themselves and to their clients, but also to the larger psychedelic community and to people who, for good reason, who get good treatment, and people who do respect people's boundaries and do care, can actually harm people in terms of taking risks that maybe they wouldn't take, or just prevent the progress and create more fear in people's minds.
Mm. Which leads to that next topic of and I will name the name Ben Sessa because it is public now, and there is legal documentation of the admitting to having a sexual relationship with the patient, and we can send out some information on that if anyone's interested, because it is quite challenging, given Ben Sessa's a psychiatrist and very prominent in the field of psychedelics, and has worked on a lot of trials and very public, and has now taught a lot of students in Australia and signed off on their certificates to be practitioners. And, you know, and unfortunately, you know, I don't want to be misquoted on the ins and outs of the case because, you know, I'm not an expert on his case, but there was a sexual relationship with a past client that had a history of suicide attempts, and has since suicided after the relationship ended. And yeah, so I guess two parts of that is, you know, what are the risks of this work, given, you know, human beings have a shadow sexuality in the psychedelic space, can be amplified, boundaries can be blurred. Kind of, you know, there was one quote that he quoted in his trial that she may have found it comforting being with him because he did basically know her. He was her psychiatrist. So that's not a direct quote, but there was almost like this kind of air of, you know, cognitive distortion around this could have been a comforting and good thing for this past patient. So I guess if you can speak to any of those complexities that even, you know, good people, new people, young people could get into when they're guiding people with MDMA or certain substances around these sexual boundaries, as well as the more like perpetrary end of the spectrum and what's out there.
Yeah, I really appreciate this issue coming up. In terms of like the idea of a client maybe feeling safer, well, of course they do. I mean, that's exactly, and that's actually the potential why there's a higher risk of potential harm, right? If you have a therapeutic relationship and you're disclosing things that you're not pursuing a romantic relationship with, and you develop a, that we keep mentioning the therapeutic alliance where there is an unequal power dynamic, and you have that bond and you have that intimacy, and then he, from what I understand, broke off the actual client relationship and then pursued, or then the relationship occurred, right? And the one question we could just generally ask is like, is it ever appropriate for you to have, if you're a therapist, a relationship with a former client? Ever? Many people I talk to is like that should just, there's so many people you could be with. You could just eliminate this small group. Because of the fact that you're at higher risk of taking advantage of that power dynamic and that intimacy and that alliance that it was created in there. And you have, and especially when you have information about them, right? Yes, that helps with greater intimacy in terms of a formal relationship, but it also, it actually, you no longer, like, how many of you would want to go to a therapist who you knew engaged with a client, right? Even though they weren't currently a client, but like they waited like 6 months and then I started having a relationship with them, type of thing, right? Most people would have concerns that maybe that their work wasn't primarily therapeutic, that maybe even that their focus was on their own self-interest versus the interest of the client, which is a breach of trust in various forms. But unfortunately, there's been a bit of a track record in the space with people taking advantage of clients, and I'm not making a position on this particular case, but at the same time, I think it's suspect, especially given the outcome, right? That and it's really unfortunate, and I just want to, give deepest sympathies to the family, and if anyone has, ever experienced, and I hope everyone has resources and support here, because some of this content can be triggering. And it just shows you again how vulnerable we are in these journey states and these experiences. And I think that we need to be really cautious, and I think the error should be on not engaging in that personal relationship, as is appropriate in regular therapeutic circumstances. But even more so for a psychedelic journey, it's like that you're at higher risk for because you may create a unique bond, and that is distinct from a regular therapeutic bond, but still in relationship to it.
Yeah. And as many women that I've worked with in the space who've had boundary violations, after they're kind of out of it, often they reflect that they didn't fall in love with the guide or the shaman. They fell in love with the safety or the idea of it. Deeply rooted from developmental trauma often, and parts work. So, even if it's consensual, I'm talking in the more in the underground space where an adult might enter a psychedelic container and then enter a relationship with the shaman for a year, or and they feel it's consensual. They're an adult, they're embedded in the community, they're it's all in agreement. But then when it ends and when they track it back, many of them, they went to that altar because of parts work, developmental trauma, sexual abuse, family ruptures, and the lure of what can happen by that person with the power, with the medicine, making them feel special, making them feel seen, then adding sexual dynamics to the mix. It's very, very complicated, and there are altars in Australia that are very well known and very even popular, and for a better word, well respected, where these sexual dynamics occurs, and there's a big split in the community around they're consenting adults. You know, and this is different from the clinical population we're talking about with Ben Sessa, but it's still a massive conversation to consider around, you know, should people that are serving medicine, taking money, be having sex with those people that they're taking, you know, and that I guess there's no black or white with that, because there's different lineages, there's different cultures around the world. But I think the complexity is how many people enter that space with that full awareness of all that complexity and the power relations, and it's very few, I would say.
Yeah, I totally I agree, because one thing that's like, I mean, take some different substance, take alcohol. Right. And you know, imagine, you know, people have entered into relationships when they've been fully intoxicated, right? And I'm not, and no one's generally going to argue that you're at your full capacity for giving good informed consent in that state, right? You know, but imagine that piece, but then a qualitatively deeper, like you're literally you know, in a state where you may not have your capacities with you at all. You don't have your full capacity for reason. And the person has experience with the state and they're not under the influence often, right? And so they are at full capacities and they may have an interest. And then it feeds into that, not just in terms of like what's supportive in creating a safe space, and like, you know, someone has, you know, trauma where they've, you know, having that experience allows them to feel maybe sexual again in a time that they haven't been able to because of past traumas, right? Many people, I mean, you know, and here's your trigger warning, like having experience of sexual violence, either in childhood or in adulthood, and are seeking psychedelic experiences to heal from them. And it's natural for that to come up in the journey state. And imagine if you get this feeling of relief in that state where you finally feel like, oh, you know, here's someone who's creating a safe space, someone who is taking control in a way. And I've even had clients who've even disclosed in an intake form to like Kieran Darrows or other people that they've had this past trauma, and they will even say like, oh, I'm doing this to help heal you. Right. And those are the cases that are, you know, particularly egregious. And they may honestly think that that's what they're doing. They may honestly think that they may be helping to heal. And it's not saying that there may not be ways of doing body work that may be helpful for healing sexual trauma. But the level of vulnerability, imagine like some of the research now is saying that it may be taking us back to a earlier brain state of our childhood, of our younger, at the very least, younger adolescence, if not younger, which is why in part we're able to access certain areas and heal them and build new bridges, new networks in the brain to be able to heal through those experiences in a way and you're not getting that from a bunch of drinks of alcohol. Right. So, no offense, because, you know, everyone should be able to have their own options. But again, and that other aspect about consent too, right? Like most people have a very, you know, small concept of what it means to have informed consent. It literally is, they basically like, if I ask you and you say yes, then I've gotten consent. But they don't have the idea of giving people enough information, giving people time, like deliberation, to consider the request, having options like, well, here's some other alternatives you could do, right? Here's a different therapeutic model, or here's, you know, here's ketamine treatment, whatever the options are. And then also, do they have the full capacity to say no? Are they comfortable saying no? Like imagine going to any sort of medical doctor and the medical doctor tells you, she says like, you need this treatment. How many people are going to get a second opinion or feel comfortable saying no when they have that power dynamic of an expert who's telling them that this is what you need and I understand it better than you, and this is, you know, and you should do this. And I'm not saying not to listen to your doctors, but that same force of listening to that reasoned wisdom person that there's good reasons for that, but then it can also create unique harm. And then now add in the spiritual element or other things like, wow, they're not only really knowledgeable and experienced, and they've helped me heal through so much, but they're so spiritual, and they have access to these other realms.
Mm.
It has another
Mm.
aspect for risk of power dynamic and harm. So.
And absolutely. And just to, before we finish that piece, just, you know, being so mindful of people working in parts, and that so many people can potentially be fawning or freezing or playing out a relational dynamic that happened when they were in high school, you know, with an abuser, or like there's some, often how someone is presenting or engaging could be really the layers behind that might not be conscious. And that's often when women that I work with say, you know, and then have the shame and the guilt, you know, I agreed, I went along with it. You know, it's my fault. But when they peel back the layers, it's like they weren't present in their body. They weren't in the capacity, you know, didn't have the space to consent. You should have been held safely to be able to process that developmental trauma yet. And that the rupture that it does to the psyche and the spirit when people enter the space looking for that healing, and then, you know, having those violations, like it can take a long time to heal that extra trauma that happens in this space. Yeah.
And to be honest, you know, I think, and I can't speak for Australian culture, but at least in terms of like the Western American culture that I've experienced, is that I think on the whole, women and men, or however you identify, don't feel safe sharing about sexual harm, no matter when it's happened.
Yes. Yeah. Let alone publicly or in a community that could jeopardize your reputation. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And then you throw in, you know, someone, you know, who you're coming to for help and support with that, who you've trusted and you're opening up to. It's it's hard to even convey like the sort of vulnerability. And it doesn't mean that people shouldn't be able to choose this. They absolutely should. But I think there needs to be an extra degree of care and support and wisdom. And also having, you know, I always feel it's really important for people to have a community of support.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if the only person they can feel like they can talk to about their experience is their provider, then that makes them more vulnerable just by the nature of the beast, right? And trying to find ways to support everyone, given that we know people are seeking healing and support, and they are going to have diminished capacity, and these are powerful substances that we need to treat with respect, and treat people with even greater respect than what we generally experience in terms of care and support for survivors in all of our cultures.
And Kayla's just put a little, well, not a little, a very powerful blog in the chat. I encourage everyone to read it and to follow Kayla's work. You know, often it takes a lot of courage to speak out on the stuff that she does. And I guess a piece on that blog was, you know, illuminating that with the Ben Sessa issue, that very few of the people who had backed him, worked with him, you know, paid him, etc., to be in these spaces. Once the findings were out, very, you know, basically no one has made any public statements, you know, acknowledging what's happened, offering support, you know. And I guess just briefly before we open up to the larger space, actually, I'll squeeze one more question in before we do that. But what do you think is an ethical response if you were a leader and you had employed someone that had, you know, sexual misconduct with a patient? You know, what is a reasonable ethical response as a leader of an organization in this space?
Well, in part it does depend on the circumstances, so I always want to honor that. In this particular case, it's someone who's actually stated that this has happened or this occurred, right? And it's documented and they've agreed. I think it's to be honest with people and to provide people the information, and you know, and acknowledge and try and talk about these issues and help educate their community, right? So like if it was someone who I was working with and this happened, I would, you know, like, you know, I want everyone to be informed, to be aware. Like, obviously, like I wouldn't have them working at the time. And unfortunately, there's been cases where people have caused harm in one country, I'm not going to name names, and then gone to another place, and then end up in a leadership or advisory role. And I certainly would feel like, you should at least acknowledge what harms have occurred or what have not occurred, depending upon what the circumstances are. Provide people with information and resources and support to help, what that rises up for them, especially if they've had a relationship with them, in friendship and as a coworker or as another former client. Right. I'd probably also maybe even consider getting an intake on other people that they've treated or supported, depending upon what kind of relationship they've had. Educational is different than, let's say, a client relationship. This is why the circumstances matter. But I think as honest and forthright as we can be, and to create information, resources, and support, and to maybe even do a special event or a community event if it's within a community, and like, let's have a conversation about it that's supported. Let's also like continue the conversation so that how we feel as an organization or as leadership, that we do not support this practice, and make it really clear what that stance is, and maybe even take additional measures, like what if there are, especially if there are any ownership in terms of the organization, in terms of fault, where they could have maybe done better due diligence or looked into things, or we didn't receive any complaints, and being transparent about what they did and didn't know, because there's also trust that's lost, not just with the person, but also with the organization and leadership.
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to add the grief of these situations. I guess in Kayla's article, she spoke about the need for people to, speak out, take accountability, be clear. But I also think as a leader personally in these spaces, is there's a huge grief when these things happen. When we put our trust in people, we get excited, we pay money, people are trained by them. Just also being able to, acknowledge that human factor, that, not just focusing on the shame element or the, obviously the legal element, which is really, really important, but just the tragedy and the grief of these leaders falling, basically, in a sense, and how we all feel about that, and holding that space. Because when I heard the news, I was just like really sad. I was sad for the students that have just been trained and all the money they've paid. And he was their leader. He was their mentor. And yeah, I think it's quite quite challenging. We need to hold space for that too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree.
Well, I've got one more question, then we'll open it up to the group. So I'm curious, what are your general comments on gatekeeping, either purposefully or accidentally? And, obviously there's many organisations around the world that run forums and chat groups and signal groups, and there's, codes of conduct, and, people can often break these codes very explicitly, with, shocking behaviour, or accidentally by, making mistakes such as, asking for illegal medicines or self-promotion, or trying to source an underground guide. And these codes are in place to protect, obviously, vulnerable people, to protect the organisation, to protect the laws around that container. But I guess some challenges that I'm, witnessing in the space is when there isn't processes around this. There isn't policy, there isn't clear mediation or timeframes for reinstatement or actual a dialogue around being kicked out of spaces. And I think as, psychedelic leaders and spaces, I think people can be quite vulnerable and quite, I guess I've got concerns around the power around gatekeeping, and when people can just decide you're out without an actual, process around it or review process. I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's challenging for a couple different reasons. One of which, gatekeeping is usually put in a negative light. And when sometimes it's out about healthy boundaries,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And community agreements, and sometimes they're very clear and explicit. And if they are clear and explicit what the community agreements are, or an organization's agreements are, or legal, right? There may be no room for any mistakes, because it could cost the whole entire organization.
Yeah.
Right? Especially if they do something like share something that was illegal, or, conflict or something in particular that would make the organization or community more vulnerable. Right. And that we would say is like a healthy use of boundaries, versus gatekeeping is usually put in the phrase, at least in then maybe more of American sense, of blocking people who should have access. And so then the question is, like, if there's someone who's removed and removed wrongfully, or maybe even rightfully, but maybe they're, is there a pathway back, right? Which is, if they don't have guidelines and things like that. Like, you think about, like you mentioned, like online forums. A lot of online forums don't even have guidelines. And if they do have guidelines, usually it's about general appropriateness of behavior. And a lot of times they're run volunteers, right?
Yeah.
And so they're not paid for, having further. They don't have a legal team necessarily to assess. And so we got to give a lot of grace for that. And then you have to work in relationship. Like, if if I were to be kicked out of something and I disagreed, then bringing it up and talking about it, I could hope that maybe it would encourage to be open to dialogue if there's not a conversation. But also, that if it's a small organization, it doesn't mean that they necessarily have an obligation to support that conversation, right? I've certainly run many communities and in lots of different spaces, and have encountered this issue myself, where we didn't have explicit policies in place, and the leadership, other people are having conversations like, okay, what do we do? And try and involve the person, even when we've removed them, trying to find a path forward. But sometimes the answer has had to be a hard no. And they're like, oh, what are your rules? What are your guidelines? I'm like, well, we don't have them. But sometimes if the person's not open to engaging in the process with us in a respectful way, then that's just what we just have to just hold the no, because of the interest of the community, or the safety of the community takes precedence over the interest of a particular individual sometimes. Like, we've had someone who was a documented sex offender in a community, and we had to take a very hard line. And you can understand why people in the community wouldn't feel safe with that person. And why we might have to say a hard no to certain areas and certain treatment. Another person who was accused of sexual misconduct with another person in the group. And we don't have the resources to do like a whole process, or to get legal support. It's like all volunteers. And it's like, look, if that comes up, we're just going to have to say a hard no. You may, they had different points of view, but, in that case, we took the hard line. And sometimes you just have to make those calls, which is challenging. But ideally, I would like, for people to have those things explicit, and when they're not, to make community agreements and to involve people in process. But I also respect the fact that, depending upon what the org is, like, a paid multinational corporation is one thing, versus like a small volunteer org or something like that is quite another. But hopefully we all work together and try and build relationship and heal from ruptures, and be willing to lean into conversations that are difficult versus avoiding them.
Yeah. And it's, it is really interesting being in the charity space, in the psychedelic space. A lot of people are doing things for the first time, like they're designing systems or, processes that haven't really been done before in Australia. And there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be, you think you finished the process, and then you're like, I don't have a procedure for this. I haven't thought about that. So yeah, it's a very interesting space, but I think, the importance of, I never really got policy before. I'm a social worker and a psychologist, and I don't know, policy never landed to me as much as it has in the psychedelic space, because there's such potential for boundaries, safety, repair, healing work, restorative practices when its policies are designed beyond personalities and beyond people. So, and that, I think that can really help with the gatekeeping. And you're right. I mean, often gatekeeping is good people wanting to protect, for good reasons. But I think, I know AMAP as well is really passionate, not that necessarily we're, perfect or have got everything right yet. We're very brand new, but designing policies proactively as much as we can, and reflecting on those policies, like, are they actually working? Are people feeling safer, or is, how do we adjust this? So yeah, really.
And policies are really limited
space.
too. At the end of the day, you want people to be able to show up, appropriately, right? So sometimes I'm actually critical of ethics codes because they can convey a false sense of security when people don't actually know how to actually, in practice, have ethical conduct. So, but to your point about the fact that many people are trying to grow policies or to figure out what is the best way to themselves, and we are human, we make mistakes, and I think we just need to have a lot of compassion and have that heart space for ourselves and for others, and just appreciate the beautiful but also the challenging aspects of this work.
Absolutely. All right, so let's move to the Q&A. I'm on my phone now, Sandra, so is it all right, because you've got a bigger screen than me? Is it all right if you maybe read the chat box, and instead of reading out the text, maybe just, if the person wants to speak to it, anything that draws your attention?
Where to start? I have to scroll back and see, like, some of these are comments, it appears. Like I'm seeing the article that Libby shared that you talked a little bit about. Erica sharing about professional boundaries. And Libby, that lovely quote about, doctors, in medical practice, they must be honest and trustworthy, and their context justifies their trust. Let's see.
Or you can just ask. Just ask the group.
If anyone wants to ask a question, just go ahead and raise your hand. I noticed also the point about there's an actual question mark that Vicky had. I don't know, Vicky, if you want to ask that question. Oh, and here, Libby, yes.
Yeah, look, I'm not at all surprised to hear about Ben, having met him and talked with him in England. And it's not about him individually. I don't want to get stuck into Ben individually. But this was possibly always going to happen. And it's a golden opportunity, I feel, for us to come together and act skillfully to highlight the issues and not be scared off by the big money in the field, who could throw some very big lawyers at to confidently walk the right line. And I would love to be in a conversation around that, because this is serious stuff, and the whole field rises or falls on these issues. I just found a Australian Stock Exchange article from Pax Clinic, which is our one over here that's been proudly hiring Ben to forge forward with it. And I mean, how they're already on the stock exchange with these offers that are just so early stage, I am shocked to see. But there certainly hasn't been any update to their investors about Ben's situation. And Mind Medicine Australia have come out with very little other than, he's stepping down. So no one seems to be taking any responsibility. There's a lot of men in the space. And I think there's a gender lens on all of this too. So I'm very concerned, not surprised, and would like us to work together powerfully within Australia, where the world is watching because of our new laws, and internationally, to seize the moment and not be scared off.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm curious, Libby, like I don't know if, and I don't know if this is for better or worse, but I don't know if situations like this will make or break the field, because if you look at sexual misconduct and sexual abuse, it happens everywhere. Schools, institutions, APRA, if you look at APRA reports, updates, like, I don't actually think it will stop psychedelic science from booming, but I think what we'll see is just the increased potential risk and like the increased potential chance it could happen. But I still think the science is going to be here, and I still think it's going to keep going. It's just that, the risk of it happening is pretty significant.
Capitalism is a very powerful force, you know, and there are some people very invested in making lots and lots of money from this. But the past doesn't predict the future, and I think that we have women's issues, you know, higher on the agenda perhaps than ever before. So I think it's good to have a realistically optimistic, you know, view on these things. Certainly policy is something that we can look at, and I have a background in stakeholder engagement and activism, so I'd like to debrief with you at some point, Lani, about, you know, what might a strategy look like to do, you know, do what we can rather than, you know, let it happen yet again.
Well, you might have to connect with me, you know, because my role at AMAP stakeholder, and these are all my, you know, passions. So it'd be great to connect another time.
I'll drop you a line.
And I really appreciate that, because like the role of larger companies, especially when they have more financial resources for things like, let's say, defamation suits in Australia, it puts a unique pressure on the Australia community to be able to support people, to be able to speak out, and to be able to communicate the harms or risks that are happening in a way that's actually supportive versus, you know, sort of like creating a gag order effect on individuals being able to speak up and out about issues that occur. And I think we're still very much coming to understand as a larger community about what the risks really are, so that we can actually really support them. And it's not that we don't do risky things all the time. I mean, you could give the example of someone jumping out of an airplane. People do that, you know, right? And we want to give people autonomy and the freedom to be able to make those sort of choices. But, you know, you still have a parachute, right? You have an understanding of what the risks are. You have like a well-trained person, you know, maybe you require someone to be on tandem, right? And you consider what the risks are unique to that, and you do more care, not less. And we're still expanding that care package, I'll say it that way, around psychedelic journeys and states and altered states, because we as a larger world community, I don't think really fully appreciate and have good care for people's consciousness, let alone people's hearts.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said. We've got time probably for about 2 more questions. And
I did see Vicky's hand come up, and I don't know whether she was asking a question around energy. Is there understanding conversation around working with sexual energy in altered states, Kundalini energy, sexual energy, current that has been damaged? Yeah, I remember actually even mentioning one time. Yeah, I'm also a Reiki master, and I've studied a lot of energy work. And it was one thing I brought up in conversation one time to Jules Evans when he asked a question about this. He writes a lot of stories, and I was like, until we're willing to talk about Kundalini and sexual energy, we probably won't be able to create, you know, safer spaces, because there's a larger appreciation for. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even give voice to it in a particular way without going into a region where people say, well, that's woo, that's not science, that's not legitimate. But if we think about it in terms of how does someone come across to you? How do they, if they're coming towards you with a sexual interest, you could say it's a sexual energy, right? We're okay with that. And the very least, we should have an understanding that people shouldn't be coming towards someone who's supposed to be taking care of someone with that energy, right? And then imagine if you've had, we'll call it sexual energy or sexuality blocks or hindrances because of trauma in the past, and you suddenly open up. You could think of that energetically. It may actually make you more sexual and more expressive for a period of time. And the temptation would be that, like, oh, this person is interested in a sexual relationship with me because they're being really very sexual, and it's opened up, then and this has actually been a challenge in the yoga spaces, for instance, or the Tantra community, and learning about and appreciating the boundaries that we cannot see, but at the very least, if we have the idea that, like, just because someone's being sexual doesn't mean that they want to have sex with you. Just because
is that the conversation that needs to be had in the psychedelic field, to open up from those areas that have already experienced this, that actually understand when this phenomenon occurs, it's actually not about allowing that to projection out into the field from the person, because they've suddenly opened up into, which is a healing process, and then that gets used or abused, which is then part of our collective consciousness, our family consciousness, shadow. Is there more conversation needed?
And if I can speak to that for a sec, Sandra.
Yeah, go ahead.
I work a lot with ketamine in cannabis legally, and with somatic. And a lot of my clients have had sexual abuse, and it's quite complex cases, and a part of the therapy is to actually avoid transference and projection work if it's there, not bleeding it, but if it naturally emerges. And I've had many clients, all genders, say, I'm feeling sexual towards you right now. I'm feeling like I'm trying to entice you. I'm trying to elicit a response from you, and they're in an altered space, and we have all this video recorded and consent forms. But what I often say is permission for you to feel that, whilst I hold the boundary of not engaging. What is that like if I don't engage? But you can still sit there and have those feelings. Obviously there's the boundary of not coming near me in that sense, but how pivotal it has been for people to be allowed to have those feelings and projections, to voice them, to feel them, and for that boundary to be held. And then often, like majority of the time, they end up crying, and it ends up being a child part or a teenage boy or other gender. And it's, they've been groomed, they've been, so it is just so tragic if someone then in those moments with a position of power then engages, because it's healing work for them to be able to have all those processes and for someone not to cross that boundary. And I don't know how well people are being trained in the trials to hold that sexual, and that energy in the room, because it is real, and it should be encouraged in a sense of within that container of safety. Because if it's not, then people get further contracted, and then their parts further exiled, and that's when ruptures in the team can happen, or they can start to think, I'm attracted to my therapist, I'm in love with my therapist, when they're not. They just need to complete this process. Yeah,
that's the sort of training or conversation, because sexual energy is our alive energy, so it's going to come up in session if they've had some deviation to their alive energy of being fully here in the world now. It's going to emerge. So, that conversations and those conversations need to be clear and honest, like you just said. For those reasons. And as a psychosexual maturity, holding the boundary while someone experiences their own sexuality and not acting on it is give them permission to hold their own boundaries in the future. So, like you said, the harm that's done when people respond to that in a way that isn't appropriate is extremely harming.
And also as a therapist, I've had my own sexual trauma and history of violence, but to be in a space where I feel safe in myself, to be in that room, because there's a lot of therapists that may not have done potentially the work, which is completely fair. And, if a client then engages on those levels, their own trigger of, am I going to be harmed? Is this, particularly if you're working one-on-one. So actually to be able to hold that container means you need to really feel safe in your own body, and belief in that client's self-energy, and be, have your practices and protocols in place that you are safe. Because it's, if a client then feels that you threatened, or you're seeing them as a perpetrator. That's, right.
It's such a huge area, isn't it, that doesn't get a lot of discussion.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, and it just shows how important, like, even just the intake and preparation period can be, right? And it doesn't have to be about the sexuality aspect. It could be about, like, do you want your hand held? Right? And I've had people come forward with violations that they've experienced under ketamine treatment, where they did not consent to being touched, like on the shoulder or on the hand or on the feet or on the head, which are often accepted areas of consensual touch and therapeutic work with ketamine in the United States, at least. And yet they don't have training on how to navigate that conversation about what feels safe for them in an ordinary state, let alone in an extraordinary state of consciousness. And being able to, like we were saying earlier about being able to say that no, but also being able to say, like, okay, if you say no, that you do not want to be touched, and then you ask me for touch during the session, I'm going to be holding that boundary. And that's going to remain a hard no. I also like to mention that consent can always be revoked, but it can't be increased. so
in the dose, it could be reviewed after, review and integration. But
yeah, and especially when you think about these, and if we can't find a way to support those what seems like smaller incidents, right, when it comes to larger expressions of sexuality and sexual expression. And I mean, I've even had people who've, in a what spiritually might be called a Kundalini awakening or consciousness experience, or a very sexualizing experience where they are, I'll be frank, are frankly orgasmic, and they're having multiple orgasm energetically experiences, and this is what, and even the person is feeling out of control because it's not something that they're consciously choosing to get engaged in. And it's confusing. And I've heard of more people with MDMA with this than with other substances. I'm not saying that that's an indicator either way, but given what the MDMA permissions with therapeutic, like we need to be able to be comfortable talking about sexuality, about physical touch, about setting up really good conversations around consent and around touch. I mean, we shouldn't assume, for instance, even if you meet someone for the first time, that we can hug them, right? and we need to create more of a consent culture in general, but especially in a psychedelic therapeutic setting.
Yeah, very well said. Yes, and again, I don't know how well that clients are being prepared for that, if sexuality is enacted in the session, and what that means, if it's being recorded and part of a trial or part of a process that's going to be watched by, inter-rater reliability kind of researchers. There's a lot of complexity around that, and helping to not, for them, to the best of your ability, not to feel shame and normalize, and it's just another form of expression. So, really helping neutralize any, a guilt and shame around those expressions. I think it's really important. Yeah. We have to wrap up soon. I could have easily gone 2 hours next time.
Very rich topic. So much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been really, incredible to weave this with you, and it won't be the last. We'll have, I think, many iterations as the years unfold, and I'll send out Sandra's kind of, bio and details as well, and stuff she's doing, and AMAPs and some other organisational stuff for everyone to consider, as well as me and Kayla wrote a blog on psychedelic cults, narcissistic leadership, and, how to assess if an organisation is safe. And we've got different checklists that were co-produced by us and Violet Caldwell, who's another social worker, but also victim survivors of cults around the world commented on the resources. And so it looks like common sense, but it's actually not. The smartest, most talented people get involved with cults and narcissistic leadership, and So we designed a lot of resources that I wish I had had before I entered this field. I would have reduced a lot of the harm I've faced in this sector. So I'm very passionate about passing that on to others. If you know anyone in the space, I encourage you to share it. If you've got students in your care, help them to have those difficult discussions. Yeah.
I would love to have those. I know we often share the psychedelic safety flags document. That was a collaborative co-creation document where it has both good things that you look for as well as like yellow, orange, red as a way to kind of help increase awareness. And I think this is just it, having community like this, having conversations, educating each other, not creating more shame, and having compassion is what we all need.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Reach out at any time, and looking forward to connecting again. Thanks,
Much love,
Sandra.
everyone. Thank you for having me.
See ya.